Alright guys, so I think this is where we left off yesterday. We were looking at the Manifest Destiny picture, and we were just trying to figure out some of the components of Manifest Destiny by just looking at the painting. So quick review, obviously we have the angel up front and center, symbolizing, of course, the sort of godly nature of Manifest Destiny. We pointed out the telegraph cables, we pointed out the railroads yesterday, and we can see them coming across westward. You notice everyone is moving westward also. That probably goes without saying. You have some farming down in the bottom right hand corner. We talked about how the natives were getting sort of run off. Will, I think you made the good point of how we have that sort of under the darkness, almost like we're bringing godliness to the savages almost. That idea, I think, is subtly present here within Manifest Destiny. So this is the sort of concept here that James K. Polk is really going to run with. He's going to almost promise Manifest Destiny in the campaign, and that's going to get him elected. And as we sort of previewed yesterday, Polk is going to be in a unique position, and that is a position where a politician is able to make good on all of his promises. So this should be a good sort of presidency here coming up. So in 1844, Polk beats the ever hopeful presidential candidate Henry Clay. He loses in several different elections, but Polk wins. And the Democrats and Polk really take this as a popular mandate. That idea of once you win an election, it's sort of like a mandate for your policies. This is why Obama went right after Obamacare, right after he got elected. Oftentimes, presidential candidates go out swinging, so to speak, swinging for the fences. So Polk is going to have an ambitious goal here, and that is essentially, as I said, to fulfill this idea of Manifest Destiny and extending the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So they take their victory here in this election as a mandate, and and they end up trying to enact this policy. And it's never ever really clear if these presidential candidates after they win do have a mandate. Obamacare obviously has been very controversial. I know Carter and Grant, you guys probably have some strong feelings on that. But it's sort of unclear here whether or not Polk has a mandate to do this. But he does have a 4-point plan. So this is sort of his plan that he tries to put into effect. So point number 1 is the lower tariffs. That's pretty easy. Restoration of an independent treasury. So we get that in 46. We'll get to that, I think, here in a second. But then the other major points here, and leading more towards Manifest Destiny, is the settlement of Oregon with Britain, and we talked about that in 1846. So we talked about that yesterday. Remember how they came up with an extension of the borderline there, and annexed the rest of that territory and extended the 49th parallel. But then California also becomes a major goal now. They want to buy it, basically, from Mexico, and Mexico isn't really dealing. Remember that we sort of tick Mexico off when we annex Texas, so they're not really all that interested in dealing with us. And this is actually going to start a war. I sort of mentioned yesterday how the annexation of Texas is going to lead to a war. I pointed to the Rio Grande, if you remember. That's the river that is the border of Texas and Mexico. And essentially what happens is Polk sends U.S. troops into that disputed land right by the Rio Grande on the Texas side. And what ends up happening is that the Mexican troops end up firing on American troops. And let's be honest here, the Mexicans are technically the aggressors here. They're the ones who fire first. They attack the Americans. But Polk's decision to move the troops into that disputed area is essentially asking Mexico to fire. And they need that because it isn't exactly clear if Polk has support in Congress to be able to actually start a war here if it's not sort of this quote-unquote defensive war. There are a lot of folks here who are actually pretty uncomfortable with the War of Mexico and pretty uncomfortable with the idea of potentially taking land from Mexico. Because when we're talking about taking land and entering states into the Union, there's the one big ugly question that keeps on coming up, right? What's that question? It's that question of slavery. And where are all the lands in Mexico in terms of the Missouri Compromise? This is all land, of course, that is south of the Missouri Compromise, which means all of this land that's going to be potentially acquired from Mexico would be slave territory. So let's not parse sort of history here. The Mexican-American War is potentially a war of sort of southern aggression, if you will, on Mexico in an attempt to expand slavery into the American Southwest. That is a major motivation here. So it's not entirely clear that an offensive war on the United States' part would have been supported in Congress, because a lot of the northern states would have not voted against war, or would have voted against war, because they're weary of the South. They're weary of the fact that war with Mexico and land gains in Mexico would potentially mean the expanse of slavery. So here's the start of the war. We have a couple of important folks. John C. Fremont is going to be out in California, and he essentially is going to work with the Americans and help overthrow the Mexicans. So Fremont is winning his battles in California, and actually he establishes his own country for momentarily, much like Texas. It's sort of the same pattern. Remember, Texas wins their independence, creates their own country, and then eventually is annexed by the United States. It's the same thing here with California. They, under John C. Fremont, they're able to kick out the Mexicans, essentially, and they create their own country and establish the Bear Flag Republic, which, again, it probably explains their state flag. So Fremont has some success in California and is able to defeat the Mexicans there. But then they also continue to make gains, as you can see here, that Kearny takes Santa Fe and then meets up with Fremont in California. So the Americans are going to have a pretty swift victories here right at the beginning of the war, right at June and August. So like I said, this war again is going to renew this slavery issue. As I just explained, the North essentially is going to say that this is a war to expand slavery, because again, this is all south of the Missouri Compromise line. So in response to this, after the war has started, the North is very afraid after these victories as to what is going to become of potential land gains in Mexico. And this leads us to the Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot, a representative from Pennsylvania, basically proposes to ban slavery in any territory taken from Mexico. So he's trying to essentially undo or get rid of this potential fear that the North has about this war. The House, of course, based on population, northern population is much larger, they pass it, but in the Senate, where representation is equal, they do not. So obviously the Southerners are going to refuse the Wilmot Proviso, but this is a good example of the idea that this war is very slavery charged. And, we're here in 1846. We're only a mere 14, 15 years away from the Civil War. And here we have slavery influencing the Mexican-American War. So the slavery issue is not really going to be resolved here. And of course, like I said, we're only 15 years away from the start of the Civil War at Fort Sumner. So we're really close to an end to this sort of idea. But politicians like Henry Clay are going to continually try to sort of kick this issue down the road, and we'll get back to that in a second. So we have Zachary Taylor, who has a great nickname. We have some great nicknames here with the Mexican-American War. We have good old Rough and Ready and old Fuss and Feathers, which is General Zach Taylor and Winfield Scott. Zach Taylor invades by land. You'll see a map here in a second. And Winfield Scott is going to invade via the sea, and Scott will eventually take Mexico City, which will mark an end of the war. You can see here that's 1847, so this war doesn't last very long, only about 2 years, and it's sort of riddled with United States victories. So the Americans win at Mexico City under Scott, and that essentially marks the end of the war, which I mentioned the other day. One of my favorite terms in U.S. history is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we're getting there to the treaty that will end this war. So here you have the campaign. So if you will look at Louisiana and New Orleans on the far right, you'll see Scott, where he came in. He lands and then works his way into Mexico City. Sorry, hopefully that wasn't too loud. You can see Kearny going through taking Santa Fe, and then meeting up with Fremont, who is working his way down in California. And then the Zachary Taylor is joining up with Scott, as you can see, up by Monterey before Scott goes down to Mexico City. So here are basically the major battles and areas. You'll notice that there are no Mexican victories. So that, again, leads us to the very fun to say Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this is signed, as you can see, in early 1848. Mexico, previously to this, had not recognized Texas as part of the United States, so they're going to recognize Texas. And then they're going to give California and much of the Southwest, including New Mexico and Arizona, to the United States. The United States will pay $15 million for that land. Remember, the United States had offered to pay $25 million previously just for California itself. Here they're giving $10 million less, while also picking up Arizona, New Mexico, and other key sort of lands here. The U.S. will also pay $3 million in debts that Mexico owed to United States citizens. So, in all told, they give about $19 million or close to $19 million, $18.25 million to Mexico in exchange for this land. But remember, that's a much better deal than what they were offering Mexico prior to the war. So this again is going to lead to a problem. We have a lot of land that wants to come into the United States, and this is all south of the Missouri Compromise line. So this would, of course, cause a big problem. We would have disrupted that balance of power. Remember how quickly we moved to settle that 49th parallel in Oregon as soon as we annexed Texas. We have to maintain that balance. Oregon free, Texas comes in slave. So something has to give here. So the North, it's not entirely clear that they are going to accept this treaty, because the North are going to, who opposed the war in the beginning, are not going to be too happy about having all of this new southern land, slave land, come into the United States. But of course there are some who actually want all of Mexico. So this actually takes some time to figure out what we're going to get. And this is interesting to note, because this is very odd for a peace treaty, where you have essentially the two different political parties in the Senate deciding the terms of a peace treaty. What do you notice about that? Who's not at the table? Mexico. So they're essentially getting this rammed down their throat. I mean, they basically folded like a house of cards in no time, and as you saw, did not win any battles at all. So maybe they just have to take it. But you'll notice that this is a peace treaty that Mexico really has no say in, which is why it is as drastic as it is. So as you can see, parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, most of the American Southwest is ceded here to the United States. This all for about $18.25 million. So two famous quotes. Remember that this is going to have a lot to do with slavery. Emerson, who's one of the transcendentalists, says Mexico will poison us. And then John C. Calhoun, yeah, we all know how cool he is, says Mexico is us, the forbidden fruit. The penalty for eating it would be like to subject our institutions to political death. So interesting sort of takes here. We'll pick up from here on the second part of the lecture.